Picture this. You're a German soldier who's spent years mocking America as weak and soft. You've laughed at stories of American troops living on chocolate and coffee. You've joked that these spoiled soldiers would crumble the moment they faced real hardship. Then you get captured. You're shipped across the Atlantic, expecting starvation, cruelty, maybe even execution. You've heard the rumors. American prison camps where you'll be worked to death, fed scraps like an animal, treated worse than dirt. But then you sit down for your first meal in an American POW camp. What's placed in front of you isn't punishment. It isn't cruelty. It's something so shocking that it will haunt you for the rest of your life. Fresh bread with butter-hot coffee, real coffee, meat and vegetables, more food than you've seen in months in that moment. Everything you believed about America crumbles, because what you're tasting isn't weakness, it's a strength so overwhelming that this nation can afford to feed even its enemies better than your own. Country feeds its heroes, the propaganda machine's favorite lilet. Me take you back to Nazi Germany, where food wasn't just sustenance, it was a weapon of propaganda. The story German soldiers heard over and over was simple. Americans are soft and spoiled. Their soldiers survive on chewing gum and chocolate, without canned fruit and coffee. They'd collapse in a weak German discipline versus American indulgence, around smoky campfires and in freezing bunkers. These stories became running jokes. While we endure black bread and cabbage soup, German soldiers would laugh, the Americans need steak and candy bars just to function. But this wasn't just about mocking enemy rations. It was about protecting German pride. Because deep down there was a terrifying thought they couldn't admit. What if an army that was both well-fed and well-armed was actually impossible to defeat? It was easier to laugh at abundance than face that frightening truth. The journey across the Atlantic, when tens of thousands of German troops were captured across North Africa, Italy and France, the bravado continued during the long voyage to America. But now the jokes had an edge of desperation. In the cramped ship holds, prisoners filled the silence with bitter laughter. Let's see how these spoiled Americans feed us. Their food will probably be inedible anyway. We'll show them what real soldiers look like. Behind the sneers was growing unease. Every clang of pots from the ship's galley, every faint smell of cooking that drifted down, reminded them of what awaited. They braced for cruelty. They braced for hunger. They braced for humiliation. None of them believed they would find kindness. But the moment their ship pulled into an American harbor, everything they thought they knew about America began to collapse. First glimpse of American power, what the German prisoners saw as they disembarked wasn't the poor, chaotic land Nazi propaganda had promised. Instead, they saw harbors lined with towering cranes, endless rows of trucks, and train-sprawling factories that never seemed to end workers moving. Cargo with precision and speed, the docks buzzed with unstoppable energy as they marched onto waiting trains. The German prisoners fell into stunned silence. Through barred windows, America flew past, fertile farmland stretching to the horizon. Neat towns with clean streets, highways, packed with automobiles, factory smokestacks, billowing productivity. Some whispered in disbelief. Others buried their thoughts, unwilling to admit what their eyes were telling them. This wasn't weakness. This was something else entirely, and they were about to discover just how powerful abundance could be. The meal that changed everything marched into POW camps, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The German prisoners braced themselves for thin soup and stale bread. Instead, they were led into orderly mess halls filled with the smell of cooking food. What they saw defied everything they'd been told. Wooden tables set in perfect rose plates piled higher than they'd imagined possible. Fresh, soft bread, actual meat and vegetables, sometimes even potatoes with gravy. And then came the real shock, steaming mugs of real coffee. For men who hadn't tasted genuine coffee in years, who'd grown used to bitter substitutes made from barley and acorns, this was nothing short of miraculous. The first meal silenced them completely. Forks clinked, spoons scraped, but few words were spoken. The food wasn't just plentiful, it was good. Some prisoners muttered that they were eating better as captives than their families back home. In that first meal, many realized something they could never say out loud. America had strength enough to feed even its enemies. The routine that broke their minds, the first meal, was shocking. But what truly shattered their expectations was what came next. Day after day, the food kept coming. This wasn't one generous gesture. This was a system breakfast. Fresh bread with butter or jam, sometimes eggs, oatmeal, even bacon lunch, stews filled with beans, peas, lentils, often with chunks of meat dinner, roast beef, pork chops, chicken with potatoes and vegetables Sundays. Even dessert, pies, puddings, canned fruit. The real revelation was the coffee. Every single day, steaming mugs of genuine coffee were handed out like it was nothing. For many prisoners, that rich aroma in the mess hall was more shocking than the sight of armed guards. The change in their bodies was undeniable. Soldiers who had marched into captivity, thin and hollow-cheeked, began putting on weight. Uniforms that had been loose from months of hunger at the front started getting tight again. American medical officers noted the irony. These prisoners of war were often healthier in captivity than they had been while serving the Reich. Letters from home, the painful truths. Weeks turned to months. Letters began arriving from Germany. Every single one told the same heartbreaking story. Wives standing in endless lines for rationed bread children, going months without meat, families living on turnips and ersatz coffee shortages, ration cards and constant hunger. Some prisoners kept these letters folded in their pockets, reading them until the paper wore thin. Each time they walked into that American mess hall, with its smell of fresh bread, its trays of meat and vegetables, its steaming mugs of real coffee, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The irony was devastating. Men who had marched off to fight for the Reich were now eating better than their wives and children back home. Some felt shame, others guilt. A few stopped writing about food altogether, afraid that honesty would wound the people they loved. Most the arguments in the barracks, the abundant food, stirred something deeper than hunger. It stirred dangerous questions, arguments, broke out among the prisoners. Hardcore Nazis insisted, American food is weakness. Luxury rots the spirit. German discipline will outlast American comfort. But others quietly wondered, what kind of nation can feed millions of its own citizens, fight a world war on 2 continents, and still feed its enemies with regular meals? Some tried to rationalize it. The Americans are trying to fatten us up like pigs before slaughter. Others whispered, maybe this is psychological warfare, give us comfort to break our will. But with every passing day, the routine never changed. The plates remained full. The meals stayed steady. The coffee stayed hot. The laughter that once came so easily was fading, replaced by an uneasy awareness that everything they'd been told might be a lie. The bigger realization over time, the food became more than survival. It became a lesson in power. The prisoners began to understand something revolutionary. Abundance wasn't weakness at all. It was strength. The Americans didn't need to starve their enemies to prove their power. They had confidence enough to feed them. That quiet confidence was more disarming than cruelty could ever have been. It demonstrated something terrifying to Nazi ideology. True strength isn't proven by starving your enemies. It's proven by having the power to feed them. Around the barracks, conversations shifted. If a nation can treat its captives with this level of order and humanity, what else might it be capable of? Maybe the propaganda was wrong about everything. For some prisoners, these thoughts lingered long after the war ended. The choice that changed lives when the war finally ended. German prisoners faced a choice: return to a devastated homeland where food was still scarce, cities lay in ruins, and the future was uncertain, or stay in the very country they had once mocked. Thousands chose to stay. They had arrived as enemies, convinced of American weakness. They left as witnesses to American strength, a strength measured not just in weapons and factories, but in the ability to show mercy even to those who had tried to destroy them. The propaganda had told them America was weak, divided, and doomed to collapse. But the reality on their plates told a different story, a nation so strong it could win a world war and still set a prisoner's table with bread, meat, and coffee. The lesson that echoed through history: what happened in those American POW camps wasn't just about food. It was about the fundamental nature of power. Nazi Germany had taught that strength came from making others suffer. That superiority was proven through cruelty and deprivation, but America demonstrated something revolutionary. True power is having the strength to be merciful. Real confidence is being able to treat even your enemies with humanity. The German prisoners who experienced this firsthand carried the memory back to Europe. In hushed tones, they told their families about the surprising kindness of their captors, about clean barracks, steady meals, and a strange kind of freedom from fear. Some could never reconcile it with what they'd been taught about American weakness. Others understood that they had witnessed something profound, a nation whose strength was so great it could afford to be generous, even to those who had tried to destroy it. The ultimate truth in the end. The German prisoners discovered that America's greatest weapon wasn't its factories, its armies, or even its atomic bombs. It was its abundance, the ability to fight the most devastating war in human history while still maintaining a level of prosperity that allowed it to feed millions, including its enemies, without strain. For thousands of German soldiers, their first taste of America wasn't bitterness or punishment, it was coffee. Real coffee, fresh bread, hot meals. It was the shocking realization that a truly powerful nation doesn't need to prove its strength through cruelty. And for many, it was their first glimpse of what the world could look like when strength is paired with mercy, when power chooses compassion over vengeance. The laughter that had once echoed through German trenches and transport ships fell silent. What began as mockery ended as reluctant admiration. Because in the end, they learned that America's greatest strength wasn't in how it treated its friends. It was in how it treated its enemies. And that lesson, served with bread, meat, and coffee, changed more minds than any propaganda ever could. The German soldiers who mocked American softness discovered that true strength isn't measured by how much suffering you can endure, but by how much mercy you can afford to show. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made with weapons, but with kindness, that's so overwhelming it shatters everything your enemies believed about you.